Striving to change one's destiny is very commendable and deserves respect. Sometimes a person manages to let go of the past, even change the future, although meanwhile those around him were sure of the inevitability of failure. Only not everyone succeeds, and it also happens that a person manages to correct the mistakes of his parents, making his life better, but then suddenly meets someone because of whom everything falls apart. That's what happened to Julie Scully. One day, her boyfriend reported the girl missing to the police. She's an American citizen. He's Greek. They lived in his homeland, so the Greek police initially did not want to look for some foreigner. But then Julie's ex-husband and her friends from America intervened. One of the friends was waiting for her to return, as Julie had called recently, letting her know she wanted to come home. Her ex-husband, although their separation was difficult and hard, still treated the girl well and wished her only happiness. That's why, as soon as they all learned about Julie's disappearance, immediately they contacted the American government in Greece. And Tim Nist, Julie's ex-husband, even tapped into his FBI connections. In the end, under such pressure, the Greek police had to act quickly and efficiently. Julie seemed to have vanished. She left her papers and belongings at home. Cell phones were rare in those years, so there was no way to call her. It was as if she'd gone out into the street and disappeared. That seemed suspicious, but even more suspicious was her fiancé, George Skiadopoulos, a young Greek man. The guy who quit his job the same day Julie Scully got divorced and came to him with almost $1 million. He told me that he and Julie were supposed to meet outside a coffee shop, but she didn't show up. He couldn't call, and he didn't look for her because he didn't know where. He waited several days before reporting her missing to the police. George then drove the car he had recently rented back to the rental company. The police immediately impounded that car to gather evidence, and they found some. They also found evidence in the trunk that Julie Scully was most likely dead. All they had to do was question George Skiadopoulos to confirm it, and then prove his guilt. And so this case became the scariest and most sensational case in Greece in the late 1990s. But how did it happen that a beautiful and young woman was victimized and murdered by a man for whom she destroyed a strong marriage? After all, she had a full-fledged family, a wealthy husband, and a healthy daughter. Her modeling career was skyrocketing, and the Trentonian newspaper, which printed the most memorable pictures of Julie, not once recognized the model as Girl of the Year. So how come she gave up everything for George Skiadopoulos? This guy was younger than her, not good-looking, and a jealous manipulator. It all seems confusing and illogical, so let's find out how it all happened. And let's start with Julie Scully's childhood, because that's usually where most of the answers are. Julie was born to Julia and John Scully. Her mom was Indian. The woman was born on a reservation. Though the tribe remained fairly large in the 1940s, there were no jobs in the settlement. The conditions in which people lived were harsh. There was no water or electricity, so all kinds of addictions flourished in those places. Therefore, Julia's parents gave their daughter to a boarding school so that she could grow up in normal conditions and get a profession. By her adulthood, the girl became like an ordinary American, and one day in 1964, she met her future husband, John Scully. He worked as a police officer, so he could give the girl a good future, and on July 2nd, 1965, they were married. January 3rd, 1968, Julie Scully herself was born. It so happened that the girl was more drawn to her father. They spent a lot of time with each other, but the mother Julie felt deprived. Every day she was getting worse. Also, her condition was aggravated by the fact that earlier, while working in a psychiatric hospital, she had become addicted to the use of hard drugs. She used to be able to control her addiction and her behavior, but the loneliness made it increasingly difficult to do so. Despite this condition, the woman soon gave birth to a second child. On November 10th, 1969, John Patrick Scully was born. The baby drew all the attention of the adults, so Julie was alone with her fears. Her father spent less time with her, and Mom divided her attention between the infant and her addiction. Until one day, Julia overdosed. In 1973, she succumbed to her addiction. Her husband had come home early from work that day, so managed to save her. Only it didn't improve the woman's condition, and the fact that her family found out about her problems made her suffer even more. At one point, she wanted to kill herself on purpose, but she was saved again by John. The relationship between husband and wife was getting cooler every day, and their marriage slowly crumbling. They lived with each other only because of the children, but they didn't notice that their relationship was also affecting their oldest daughter. Julie was already 9 years old at the time. She saw how her parents fought and how their relationship deteriorated, and how their family changed when her father had a mistress. John Scully didn't even hide that much. That's when the girl started to take a turn for the worse. Her grades at school deteriorated. Her relationship with her parents began to deteriorate. Her rebellious nature began to emerge. Scully's family lived in a rough neighborhood, and at some point they moved the girl to a better place. The parents were still very concerned about Julie. After all, the girl was growing up beautiful, and that could attract trouble. But in the end, she herself got in touch with a bad company, from which the grades spoiled even more. Already at 14, she wanted to quit school. In 1982, Julie graduated from high school. Then her father convinced her to continue her studies. It was he who tried to get his daughter into the School of Engineering. Actually, to enter there was very difficult, but John Scully himself personally went there to convince the management that they needed to accept his daughter. One of the reasons that made the management accept the girl was that she was a Native American. Thus, in 1983, Julie enrolled in a school with a focus on engineering. A year later, her grown-up brother, who grew up in the same circumstances as her, took a very unexpected step. He was 16 when he joined the Navy. In this way, he solved many problems and settled his future for many years to come. Julie, on the other hand, dropped out of school during the same period. After a while, she met a man. It was Neil Ziegler. He was older than her, but he was the one who gave her the sense of stability she lacked. Perhaps because of the problems in her family, the girl was in excessive need of attention. She craved it, but her family didn't give her enough, so she began to get what she lacked through male attention. Neil, on the other hand, surrounded her with what Julie lacked. As it happened, their marriage was secret. No one in her family knew about it. And her father John was a police officer. He always boasted that no matter how rambunctious his daughter was, he always knew where she was. But in the end, even he wasn't privy to Julie's marital status. When he did find out about his daughter's marriage, though, John didn't mind. On the contrary, it seemed like a good idea to him. After all, then the daughter would leave the house of a drug addict mother and could start her own happy life. In 1985, the couple married, and 3 years later in 1988, they were already divorced. Julie Scully was very beautiful, and every year her beauty only blossomed. And then, one day in July 1989, she got to a party at the Yacht Owners Club, and that's where she met her future husband, Tim Nist. He was also older than Julie, but this time as much as 11 years. He was rich and even had his own private yacht. He had started a landscaping business. His business grew rapidly because at that time real estate sales were steadily increasing and there was a demand for landscaping. Tim and Julie's relationship was growing stronger and was filled with love and passion, but at the same time, Julie was very jealous. Perhaps the lack of attention in her childhood, or the fact that she often saw her father leaving for his mistress played a role in this. But there were times when the girl, without understanding, hit Tim in the face or attacked a stranger sitting next to her, thinking that she was flirting with her husband. Tim, despite all this, continued to love Julie, and on November 18, 1991, they were married. Julie was 23 years old. As already noted, the girl grew up very beautiful. She was not once asked if she was a model. At some point, she herself lit up with the dream of becoming a model. She was already with Tim when she saw an ad in the newspaper for a photography contest, but it wasn't a real ad. At that moment, newspapers were going broke and losing readers, so many created fake excitement with pages for men. There they published pictures with beautiful women in the likeness of special men's magazines. And this contest was a great way to get pictures of women and then legally publish them. Julie, on the other hand, hoped to win. But in the meantime, she fired Tim's assistant in the office and started working part-time for her husband. It suited her, because this way she had a free schedule, and also she had no reasons to be jealous of her husband, and Tim Nist didn't mind. However, Julie kept waiting to hear back from the editorial staff about the contest. Only no one wrote to her, so one day she simply stormed into the office of the newspaper where she sent the photo and made a scene. That's how she met Cheryl, the editor-in-chief, and even became friends with her. Then she began to publish frequently in the newspaper. Many advertisers were interested in her, and she also began to participate in many small beauty contests and even win occasionally. On the other hand, her modeling career was growing, but at the same time in the field of high fashion, she was not interested. Also, Julie began to abuse alcohol at some point. Her relationship with Tim again began to deteriorate. They even started seeing a marriage counselor. The psychologist really wanted to help the young woman. That's why he delved into Julie's past, trying to find an answer to the current problems there. But the woman was shutting down and unwilling to listen to advice. And Tim just wanted children. They were wealthy, they could afford a child and provide everything that child needed. Only Julie was afraid. Again, her past played its own part. Plus, modeling was stressing her out. She drank more and more. But then, in February 1995, she suddenly became pregnant. According to Julie's friends, she continued to lead the same lifestyle. She drank and lied and smoked. But this did not prevent, as once her mother gave birth to a healthy child. On November 26, 1996, Julie and Tim's daughter Katie Scarlett was born. The birth of the girl also influenced Julie's mother, Julia. For the sake of her granddaughter, she stopped using drugs and then moved closer to her daughter to help with her granddaughter. Julie Scully, on the other hand, began experiencing bouts of depression after giving birth. For so many years, she perceived herself as the most beautiful, but childbirth had changed her figure in its own way. Julie was worried that because of her pregnancy, she would not be able to return to modeling. Because of this, she went back to her former lifestyle of alcohol and raucous parties. Tim tried his best to save their marriage, but he was not strengthened even by the birth of a daughter. And though Julie loved her daughter, it didn't save her from depression. To get away from it all and get a change of scenery, the couple went on a cruise. They left their daughter to her parents and went on a trip to strengthen their relationship. They boarded a cruise ship in November 1997, and that's where Julie met George Skiadopoulos. He was a new employee who had just taken a job in the ship's engineering department. He lied to her that he was 28, even though he was only 22. It was his first job, but he knew how to present himself confidently. So while introducing himself to the spectacular Julie, he told her he was the ship's captain. Tim saw the attention the young man was paying to his wife, but he was used to Julie being sociable and attracting the attention of strangers everywhere. And George had managed to interest the young woman. He had a knack for seducing her, and she didn't know that he was interested in her because of an argument, because he had bet his coworkers that he would sleep with her. She felt the spark she had long lost with Tim. She had even lost her head once and kissed George passionately when they were alone together. After the trip, Julie shared what had happened with her friend Tony. She was overwhelmed with emotion, but her whole cruise romance might have ended there if George hadn't written to her. He was persistent. He also wished Julie would divorce her husband and be with him. Julie was faced with a choice. She didn't want to drastically change her life, and she loved her daughter. She didn't want to change her life so drastically either. The woman began again to behave with the family aloofly and coldly. Then Tim, to support his wife again, decided to throw her a party in honor of her birthday. It was her 30th birthday. He invited all her friends and acquaintances. He organized a lavish celebration. On January 3rd, 1998, Julie had one of the most memorable days of her life. That same day, instead of a gift, she asked her husband for another cruise. But only this time, she asked for a specific ship and specific dates. Tim was puzzled, but nevertheless agreed to his wife's wish. On February 13th, the couple went on a trip, but Julie specifically chose this flight because she knew George would be there. After the trip, she shared all her feelings with her friend Tony again. She also told him that she met George again, but this time their resort romance took a new stage and they slept together. Their affair became more and more passionate. They continued to communicate on the phone. One day in March of that year, Julie organized a trip for herself, her daughter, and her mother. They traveled to Florida, where Julie confessed to her mother that she had fallen in love with someone else. The mother did not approve of her daughter's behavior, but she was unable to interfere with her plans. As soon as they arrived at the hotel, Julie went to Puerto Rico to stay with George. She spent the entire vacation with him and then returned home with her mother and daughter. After that trip, she pretty much stopped hiding. She had long phone conversations with George in front of her husband. She was already planning how she would demand a divorce. She wanted to go with Katie to Greece with George, but then Tim got the phone bills, and that's when the man made his final decision. He demanded an answer from his wife, and she asked him for a divorce. Among Julie's friends, no one approved of her having a relationship with the Greek. They didn't like him, but that didn't stop Julie. She got a divorce as well as money in the amount of $800,000. The only thing the woman failed to do was get her daughter. Tim flatly refused to give Katie away, but even this did not stop Julie, and she went to Greece to her lover. Her family and friends didn't know much about how Julie's life changed after she left. She called less and less often, until one day she called a friend in January 1999. Julie confessed that she missed her daughter terribly and wanted to come home. Her friends supported her and told her that they were all just waiting for her return. For the next few days, the friend waited for Julie to call to let her know when she was coming. But she got a call from George. He told her that Julie was missing. The friend didn't believe the man right away. Julie couldn't just disappear after admitting she wanted to come back. So she called Tim and told him what had happened, and then she and Julie's other friends called the American Embassy in Greece to keep the local police from not investigating the case. Tim Nist also called the police station in Greece to find out how the case was going. Complicating matters was the fact that the few people at the station spoke English, so Tim contacted his FBI contacts. Julie's friends began to spread information about the girl's disappearance in Greece. Thus, their actions created a resonance. Everyone was talking about the case, so the Greek police had to seriously deal with the case of the missing foreign girl. Because of this, one day George called the very friendly Julie and yelled at her. He didn't want to make a fuss, and that made Julie's friends doubt the Greek even more. And then details began to emerge about how Julie's life in Greece really was. She did not know the language, and the relationship with George's parents did not work out almost immediately. The woman had to hide her past and her daughter. Meanwhile, George himself quit his job and wanted to start his own business, using Julie's money, which she received after the divorce. To do this, he convinced her to set up their joint account. He also forbade her from contacting her friends in America and her family. Therefore, she only called them when the guy was not at home. It also became known that periodically he could get angry and hit Julie. As it turned out, his mom had schizophrenia, and this disease could easily pass to her son. That's why George, with his very mediocre appearance, considered himself a valuable man. He had problems with his hair as well as his teeth. The man was also impulsive and jealous, and he also had manipulative tendencies. Because of all of this, he wouldn't let Julie get back into modeling, although they were having more and more financial problems every day. The police found out about this 16 days after Julie's disappearance, and as soon as it became known that the man returned the car he had recently rented, the police immediately took it away for inspection. There they found the blood and other traces in the trunk. It became clear that something terrible had happened to Julie Scully. There was enough evidence to bring in George for questioning. He was questioned for 4 hours. At first, he stuck to the old story, that they'd arranged to meet outside McDonald's. He showed up and waited a long time for Julie, but she never showed up. A few days passed, and only then he realized that Julie had disappeared. All of her belongings and papers had been left at home, although he had mentioned before that one of the officers had taken Julie's passport. Only the name of that officer George couldn't say, nor could he describe his appearance. And during a search of George's home, the police found the lost passport. At some point, the man couldn't stand it and confessed everything. It turns out that Julie was disappointed in almost everything immediately after arriving in Greece. She saw a different side of George. She did not like the country itself. The relationship with the parents of the boyfriend did not work out. She missed her daughter, her friends, and her home a lot. The situation was getting worse, so George began to forbid her calling home. More and more often, he began to take it out on the woman and even raised his hand at her. But it got even worse when George's mother found out about Julie's past. Then the already bad relations in the family deteriorated completely. On January 8th, 1999, Julie and George rented a car and went on a trip. They had previously planned to go to Athens to get married, but suddenly Julie started talking about canceling the engagement. She wanted to break up with him and go home. That didn't suit George. He planned to get the remaining money after the wedding to invest in business. The couple began to fight. At one point, George stopped the car in a deserted area and got out. He then opened the door on Julie's side and squeezed the woman's throat hard. Under questioning, George swore that he didn't understand why he did it. He said it was as if the whole thing was not happening to him. Perhaps he was trying to pretend he was crazy. But the police found that hard to believe, because it takes at least 3 minutes to strangle a person. In the end, he killed Julie and then threw the body in the trunk. He planned to burn the dead body, so he drove to a gas station first and bought gasoline. Then he drove to a remote location to set the body on fire. But it started to rain, so the body did not burn. The man had to put the already burnt body in the trunk again. George went to his grandmother's house to get an old suitcase. He wanted to hide the body in it and throw it into the sea. But the corpse was getting stiff, so it wouldn't fit in the suitcase. So George just cut off the head and packed the body up. George told how much he admired Julie then, that she was beautiful even in death, so he couldn't help but kiss the severed head on the lips. Then first he threw the suitcase with the body into the swamp, and at the end he drove to the sea and threw the head off a cliff. George told in detail how everything happened, and then showed where and how he hid the body. Thanks to this, Julie's remains were discovered. Tim Nist immediately traveled to Greece to personally transport his ex-wife's body back home to America. He wanted to bury her at home among family and friends. It didn't bother him that they had parted badly. He still remembered Julie with warmth and didn't want her life to end this way. The Skiadopoulos family, on the other hand, was shocked by George's actions. They didn't understand how or why their child could do such a thing, and even if he did, why he didn't kill himself afterward. George, by the way, during the interrogation often spoke words of regret about what happened and that he wanted to kill himself. First, he thought of jumping into the sea at the same place where he threw the head out. Then he tried to shoot himself and poison himself with medication, but didn't succeed. Only the police didn't believe it, especially after the story of how the man tried to dispose of the body. The case caused a wide resonance in 2 countries at once, in Greece and in the United States. Some swore at George and called him a dangerous person, but for some reason not a few people opposed the victim. They were of the opinion that Julie deserved such an end after her own mistakes in life. But Tim and Julie's friends continued to remember her with warmth. Tim was supportive of Julie's entire family and tried to instill in his daughter only good memories of her mother. The woman's friends, on the other hand, were all convinced that George had only started dating Julie for money. That's why he killed her when she wanted to break up with him. They expected the verdict in this case to be harsh. George himself had asked for capital punishment, only Greece didn't have the death penalty. Soon the defendant himself confessed to the crime. The trial was scheduled for November 1999, and in December he was found guilty. He was given life imprisonment without parole. And it would seem this case is over. Julie's killer is punished and behind bars. But in 2002, George filed an appeal. Even during the first trial, his defense attorneys emphasized that the defendant is subject to a genetic disease, which was passed on to him from his mother, that he had all the hallmarks of schizophrenia. But if during the first trial George himself did not show much interest to reduce his sentence, everything changed during the appeal. He did everything he could to get his sentence reduced, and at one point the court approved his petition and reduced his sentence to 23 years and even gave him the right to appeal again. And then in 2007, George Skiadopoulos was released early. Thus, for the brutal murder and abuse of the body, George served only 8 years. Now the man lives somewhere in Greece. He has a wife and children. And Julie Scully remains in his past, which can be forgotten. So a girl who just wanted the simple woman's happiness was murdered, and her killer went on with his life as if nothing had happened.